So, what happens when the American dream just grinds to a halt? Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic and formative decades in modern history, the Great Depression. It's a story of absolute collapse, for sure, but it's also a story of incredible resilience. Let's get right into it.
To really wrap our heads around this, forget the spreadsheets and stock tickers for a second. Instead, picture a massive economic storm. We're talking a storm so huge, it didn't just cause a little damage. It literally reshaped the entire American landscape for a generation.
So what was the Great Depression, really? I mean, how did an entire nation find itself in such a desperate situation? And what was it actually like to live through it? That's exactly what we're going to break down. To understand the Depression, you have to look at its recipe for disaster. See, this wasn't caused by one single thing. Nope, it was more like a toxic mix of different problems that all collided at the exact same terrible moment.
And I love this analogy. Think of it like baking a really bad cake. You've got several bad ingredients. Now on their own, maybe they just make for a slightly weird-tasting dessert, but when you mix them all together, you get an absolute economic catastrophe.
So what were these main ingredients? Well, you've got the infamous stock market crash, a huge crisis of overproduction, a terrifying wave of bank failures, a rigid money system called the gold standard, and, yeah, the lingering economic scars from World War I. Let's take a closer look at each one.
First up, the most famous ingredient, the stock market crash. All through the 1920s, the market was just soaring. It felt like a party that would never end. People were borrowing money, investing everything they had. Then, in October 1929, pop. The balloon didn't just deflate, it burst. Fortunes were just gone, wiped out overnight.
Next, you've got this problem of overproduction. The Roaring Twenties saw factories and farms churning out goods at an incredible pace. But here's the catch. People's wages weren't keeping up. So you had this bizarre situation where warehouses were overflowing with products that ordinary folks simply couldn't afford to buy. It was a massive imbalance just waiting to tip over.
So when businesses failed and people lost their jobs, they couldn't pay back their loans. And that sent a massive shockwave right through the banking system. The entire country's piggy bank. As the first few banks started to fail, panic set in. People made a run on the banks to get their cash out, which, of course, created a vicious cycle, causing even more banks to collapse and taking people's life savings right down with them.
And you got to remember, this wasn't just an American problem. The crisis was made even worse by a rigid international money system called the gold standard. Basically, it tied the value of money to gold, which really tied the hands of governments. They couldn't just increase the money supply to help their economies. Add that to the massive debts left over from World War I, and the whole global economy was like a tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
Okay, so we've seen the economic ingredients for this disaster. But these weren't just abstract ideas. They had a devastating, real-world human cost. What did it actually feel like to be caught in this storm? Let's look at that human story of survival.
Just let this number sink in for a moment. By 1933, around 13 million Americans were out of work. That's about a quarter of the entire workforce. This wasn't just a downturn, it was a level of joblessness the country had never, ever seen before.
For those who lost everything, and I mean everything, survival meant building shanty towns from whatever scraps they could find. These places were bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, a jab at the president a lot of people blamed for their situation. This quote here really paints a raw picture of the desperation. Small villages made of cardboard boxes and scraps.
And the hardship created this awful domino effect that just rippled through every part of society. The first domino was poverty and hunger. So many children suffered from malnutrition. Then, on top of all that, came an environmental disaster, the Dust Bowl, a massive drought that forced millions of people from their homes. And finally, the strain reshaped the very fabric of family life itself.
But, it's often out of the deepest desperation that we see the most dramatic action. Faced with a nation on its knees, the government, under a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, decided it had to do something bold and something new. And that response was called the New Deal. Now, it wasn't one single law, but this huge collection of programs, reforms, and public works projects. The goal was pretty simple: relief for the suffering, recovery for the economy, and reform of the whole system so this could never happen again. It was, simply put, a helping hand to pull people back up.
So what did that helping hand actually look like? Well, you had programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. which put hundreds of thousands of young men to work planting trees and building parks. And then there was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which hired millions to build the public infrastructure we still use today: roads, schools, hospitals, you name it.
Now, the Great Depression eventually ended with the economic boom of World War II, but its impact, man, that lasted for generations. It forced the country to ask some really fundamental questions about itself and about what it had learned from this incredibly difficult time.
And maybe the most crucial lesson is this: the Great Depression fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government. The whole idea that the government had a responsibility to provide a social safety net, things we now take for granted like Social Security and unemployment insurance, that was born directly out of this crisis.
But beyond all the policies and programs, there's a deeper, more human lesson here. This period of intense hardship revealed an incredible kind of resilience. It was almost as if the crisis forced the nation to grow deeper roots. Communities came together, neighbors helped neighbors, and Americans discovered a collective strength they maybe didn't even know they had.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. The Great Depression isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a story packed with lessons about our economy, about our society, and about what we're capable of when things get tough. So the question is, which of those lessons do you think is the most important for us to remember today?